My parents kicked me out for going to community college. 18 years later, they watched me win $2 million at a gala. But my father stood up and walked out when they called my name. I'm 37 years old. I'm a professor at Cambridge. And last week, something happened that still has me processing a bunch of emotions I thought I'd left behind like a decade ago. I went to a gala, one of those fancy things where you put on a dress that costs more than you should spend and smile for photos. And it turns out I came face to face with my parents after 18 years of not seeing them. 18 years. And the worst part, or the best part, I still don't know, is that I ran into them right when I was receiving an award for my research in environmental chemistry. The irony is brutal. You know what I mean? I guess I should start from the beginning so this makes sense. When I was like 16 or 17, I basically fell apart. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it was like one day I woke up and all the weight of my parents' expectations hit me all at once. My father owned Mosaic, a pretty big fertilizer company, and my mother was one of those women who organize charity galas and have lunch with other rich ladies talking about who knows what. We lived in one of those huge houses where everything looks perfect from the outside, but inside there's a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature, you know? My parents were never affectionate, but they weren't abusive in the traditional sense either. It was more like a calculated indifference, as if I were a project that wasn't giving the expected results. The thing is that in high school, I started sinking into a horrible depression. My grades, which before were decent, went to shit. I spent my days feeling like I was walking underwater. Everything was a huge effort, getting out of bed, going to classes, pretending everything was fine. And my parents, instead of asking what was wrong with me or taking me to therapy or something, just focused on the numbers. My mother would say things like, "I don't understand why you can't just try harder, Victoria," as if depression were a matter of willpower. My father didn't even talk to me. He just looked at me with that disappointed face that made me feel like I was a failure in his perfect system. When it came time to apply to universities, it was a total disaster. I only got accepted to the local community college, and when my father saw that acceptance letter, he literally exploded. I remember that day perfectly because it was like my life split into a before and after. I was 19 years old, had just turned 19, I think, and I was in the kitchen when he came home from work. My mother was there too, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine. As always, my father opened the letter, read it, and his face turned red. He said something like, "This is unacceptable, Victoria. A daughter of mine is not going to go to a community college. It's an embarrassment to this family." I tried to explain that I could transfer after 2 years, that I just needed a little time to recover, but he didn't want to hear anything. He told me I had until the end of the week to get out of his house. Just like that. My mother didn't even protest. She just took a sip of her wine and looked away. I remember standing there thinking, is this really happening? Are they seriously kicking me out? But yes, it happened. That week was surreal. I packed my things while they acted like I didn't exist anymore. My father wouldn't even look at me when we passed each other in the hallways. The day I left, I took everything I could in my old car, a 2006 Honda Civic that was technically mine but they had paid for, and I went to live with my Aunt Lydia, my mother's younger sister. Aunt Lydia was like the black sheep of the family, because she had married a plumber and lived in a normal house, in a normal neighborhood, no mansions or galas. But she was the only person in my entire family who actually cared about me. When I told her what had happened, she was furious. She told me I could stay with her as long as I needed, not to worry about anything. She lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and she gave me the guest room. The first few months were really hard because I was still dealing with depression and now also with my parents' rejection, but little by little I started to move forward. I enrolled in community college and got a job at a diner that was like 3 blocks from school. The job was horrible, one of those where you come home smelling like grease with your feet destroyed, but I needed the money. I worked night shifts and studied during the day, and honestly, the first few months I thought I wasn't going to make it. Everything was so overwhelming, so different from the life I'd had before. But then something happened that changed everything. In my intro chemistry class, the professor, Dr. Collins, an older man like 60 years old with thick glasses and always with chalk stains on his jacket, gave us our first major exam. I studied like crazy for that exam because something about chemistry made sense to me in a way that nothing else in my life made sense at that moment. There was something comforting about chemical reactions, about everything following specific rules, about if you did A and B, you always got C. And when I got that exam back and saw a 92% written in red at the top, I cried right there in the classroom. Dr. Collins asked me to stay after class and said, "Miss Hayes, you have a real talent for this. Don't waste it." It was the first time in years that someone told me I was good at something, that I had potential. You don't know what that meant to me. From then on, I became obsessed with chemistry. I took every course I could, spent hours in the school lab, read textbooks for fun. I sound super nerdy, I know, but it was the only thing that made me feel like I had a purpose. Dr. Collins became like a mentor. He helped me with extra material, recommended books, talked to me about research and what the real academic world was like. 2 years later, I graduated from community college with honors and transferred to a 4-year state university. Aunt Lydia went to my community college graduation, screamed my name when I went up on stage, and everything. It was super embarrassing, but also beautiful. My parents, of course, didn't show up. I didn't even know if they knew I was graduating. We hadn't spoken in 2 years by that point. University was harder, obviously, but also more exciting. I was able to dive deep into research, worked in a lab studying contaminants in water systems, and discovered I was good not just with theory, but also with practical work. I graduated with a bachelor's in chemistry with honors, and again, only Aunt Lydia was there. By that point, I had accepted that my parents were never going to be proud of me, that no matter what I accomplished, to them I was always going to be the daughter who disappointed them by going to a community college. But the thing is that it didn't matter to me as much anymore. Or at least that's what I told myself. After graduating, Dr. Collins, who by then was like a grandfather to me, connected me with a professor at Oxford who was looking for master's students for a research project on sustainable fertilizers. Oxford, in England. Not even in my wildest dreams had I thought of something like that. I applied, not expecting much, and when they accepted me with a full scholarship, I couldn't believe it. It was as if all the shit I'd gone through suddenly made sense. You know what I mean? I told Aunt Lydia, obviously, and she cried with happiness. But I didn't tell my parents. I don't know why. I guess part of me wanted to keep it secret, as if telling them would ruin it somehow. I moved to England when I was 24 years old, I think, and it was terrifying and exciting at the same time. Oxford was everything I had imagined and more. Those old buildings, the perfect gardens, the feeling that you were surrounded by centuries of knowledge. I completed my master's in 2 years, and then, almost without thinking much about it, I continued with the PhD. My research focused on developing fertilizers that were less harmful to the environment, specifically on how to reduce nitrogen pollution in aquatic systems. It was dense work. I spent hours in the lab, but I loved every second. The years at Oxford were probably the best of my life up to that point. I made friends, went out occasionally, even had a couple of relationships that didn't work out, but that made me feel normal. Aunt Lydia visited me twice, and each time we cried when she had to leave. She was the only connection I had to my previous life, but it was enough. My parents still didn't know where I was or what I was doing, and I wanted to keep it that way. There was something liberating about reinventing myself completely, about being just Victoria Hayes, PhD student, not Victoria Hayes, the rejected daughter. I graduated with my PhD when I was 29, and shortly after I was offered a position as a professor at Cambridge, literally, one of the most prestigious places in the world to do scientific research. I accepted without thinking twice. I'd been living in England for 10 years by that point, and I'd gotten used to it. The horrible weather, the tea all the time, the way people say sorry for everything. I'd even picked up a bit of the British accent without realizing it. The next few years were about establishing myself in my career. I published several papers on my research, got grants to continue my work, supervised PhD students, taught classes. My life was stable, even satisfying. I didn't think much about my parents, honestly. Every now and then I wondered how they were, if they were still together, if they ever thought about me, but they were passing thoughts. I had built a life completely independent of them, and I was proud of that. And then came last week. The university nominated me for an award at a gala organized by an environmental science foundation. It was one of those fancy things, at an expensive hotel in London, with hundreds of people from the academic and business world. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to win anything. I thought it was going to be a night of fancy food and boring networking. I put on a dark blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, did my hair, the whole show. I arrived at the hotel around 7 at night, and the place was impressive, with huge chandeliers and tables with flower arrangements that probably cost more than my first car. I was at my table with some colleagues from Cambridge, drinking wine and trying to seem more relaxed than I was, when I decided to go to the bathroom before the speeches started. The bathrooms were on the second floor, and when I went in, it was empty, except for a woman who was in front of the mirror touching up her makeup. I didn't pay much attention to her at first, but when she saw me in the mirror, she froze completely. And then I realized it was my mother. I hadn't seen her in 18 years. 18 years. And there she was, in front of the bathroom mirror at a hotel in London, wearing a gala dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked older, obviously. She was like 60-something years old by that point. But she was still her, with that air of superiority she'd always had. We stared at each other for what seemed like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I didn't know what to do. Whether to say something, whether to leave, whether to just stand there like an idiot. She spoke first. She said, "Victoria," with that voice she used when she was surprised but trying not to show it. I just nodded. The words wouldn't come out. She asked me what I was doing there, and I said, "I work at Cambridge. I'm nominated for an award tonight." I could see how she processed that information, how her eyes moved trying to understand how the daughter she had rejected 18 years ago was now at the same gala as her. She said something like, "Your father is here too. His company is one of the sponsors of the event." And I thought, of course he is. Of course this perfect moment of my life had to include my parents in some twisted way. There was no hug, no apologies, just an awkward conversation of like 2 minutes where she asked me superficial things and I gave vague answers. Then she said we should go back to the hall. And that was it. When I returned to my table, I was shaking. My colleagues asked me if I was okay, and I told them yes, just nervous about the awards. I couldn't concentrate on anything after that. I kept looking for her in the crowded room, wondering what table she'd be at, if my father had also seen me. The speeches started, and I was trying to pay attention, but my mind was elsewhere. And then came the moment for the awards. First, they gave some minor recognitions, and then the presenter, an important man from the foundation, announced the main prize. He said that this year they were going to give a $2 million grant to continue the winners. Research. $2 million. I thought, wow, whoever wins that is super lucky. And then he said my name, Victoria Hayes, for her groundbreaking work in developing sustainable fertilizers that reduce nitrogen pollution in aquatic systems. I heard my name but didn't register that it was me. My colleagues started screaming and applauding, and one of them pushed me slightly, telling me, "Get up, you won." I stood up on autopilot, walked toward the stage feeling like I was in a dream. The presenter gave me a certificate and a heavy crystal trophy, and there were photos and applause, and I could only think about my parents being somewhere in that room, watching this. While I was on stage, I searched the crowd and saw them. My mother was sitting with a neutral expression, clapping politely, and my father, when our eyes met, got up from the table and left the room. He literally left. He couldn't even stay to see his daughter receive a $2 million award. I saw him leave, how he disappeared through the doors of the hall, and I felt a mixture of rage and sadness that almost made me cry right there on stage. But I stayed composed, smiled for the photos, gave a short thank you speech that I don't remember what I said, and went back to my table. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, someone from the foundation approached me to congratulate me and explain the details of the grant. He told me the money came from several corporate sponsors and mentioned that one of the main ones was Mosaic Fertilizers. Mosaic, my father's company. The grant I had just won was partially funded by my father. The irony was so absurd I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All this time building a life away from him, proving to myself that I could make it alone, and it turns out my greatest professional achievement was connected to him in some way. I decided to look for him. I don't know what drove me to do it, but I needed to confront him. I needed to tell him something. Anything. I found him outside the hotel, smoking a cigarette, although I didn't remember him smoking. He saw me approach and I knew from his face that he knew we were going to have this conversation. I said to him, "So you're leaving. You can't even congratulate your daughter." He looked at me and said something like, "You should be grateful. That money comes from my company." And I exploded. I told him everything I had kept inside for 18 years. That he had kicked me out when I needed him most. That he had been absent my whole life. That he was never a real father. That I had achieved everything I had without his help. That I didn't need his validation or his money. He just looked at me with that expression of indifference. I hated so much. When I finished, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "You did all this to prove something to me, Victoria, but all it proves is that you're still the little girl desperate for my attention." And he left. Just like that. He got in his car and left. I stood there at the entrance of the hotel, with my trophy in my hands, feeling empty. All the triumph of the night had evaporated. I went back inside, said goodbye to my colleagues saying I wasn't feeling well, and took an Uber back to my apartment in Cambridge. The trip was like 2 hours, and the whole time I was thinking about what he had said, about whether he was right, about whether everything I had accomplished was just an elaborate way of seeking his approval. The next few days were weird. I thought a lot about what to do with the grant money. Technically, it was mine to use in my research, but knowing it came partially from my father, it felt tainted somehow. I talked to Aunt Lydia on the phone, told her everything, and she said that what my father thought didn't matter, that I had won that award on my own merit, not because of him. She was right. I knew it. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. In the end, I made a decision. I donated the entire amount, the $2 million, to create a scholarship fund for low-income students who wanted to study science, specifically for students starting at community colleges. When I announced the donation, there was a lot of coverage in academic press, and some colleagues told me I was crazy for giving away so much money. But it felt right. It felt correct. It was my way of taking something that was connected to my father and turning it into something that would help people like me, people who had been rejected or underestimated, but who had potential. I haven't heard from my parents since that night. I don't expect to either. Aunt Lydia told me my mother called her a couple of days after the gala, asking about me, but she didn't give her my number. I don't know what she wanted to tell me, and honestly, I'm not interested in knowing. I've gotten to a point where I understand I'm never going to have perfect closure with them. There's never going to be that movie moment where they apologize and everything gets fixed, and that's okay. Or at least I'm convincing myself it's okay. What I do know is that I built a life that makes me feel proud. A life that has meaning beyond proving something to someone. I'm still teaching at Cambridge, still doing my research, and now I'm also involved with the scholarship fund I created, helping to select the students who are going to receive them. Last week, I met a 20-year-old girl who just finished her associate degree at a community college and is going to transfer to a 4-year university with one of the scholarships. She told me her story, how her parents didn't believe in her, how she worked nights and studied during the day, and it was like seeing myself 15 years ago. I told her she could do it, that I understood her more than she thought. I guess that's the thing with family trauma. It never completely goes away. There are always moments where it resurfaces and makes you question everything. But it also teaches you things, makes you stronger in ways you didn't expect. I'm not going to say I'm grateful for what happened because that would be a lie. But I can say that I survived. That I moved forward. That I built something good despite everything. And maybe that's enough.